Good evening, and I want to thank all of you who've stayed to the end of this very long day. It's not quite over yet, but we will not take more of your time than anybody else. Like others before me, we will cover an entire continent in about 40 minutes, and that will be our challenge. Now, I am Serge Schmemann. I'm a member of the editorial board of the New York Times. An editorial board is a group of unelected people offering unsolicited advice on world affairs. So this is a good role for us. We will be talking today about Latin America, and in my preparatory reading, I found a very kind of dual image of the continent on every front. On the one hand, we're talking about one of the most promising regions in the world. There's no wars. It's the most democratic region in the developing world, and it's set to become an economic powerhouse with all the kind of green minerals that will be necessary for a green world. And at the same time, you read about a lot of bad news, democratic backsliding, politics that veer from far left to far right without any notice, and a region plagued by inequality, crime, drug trafficking, social upheavals. And despite similarities of language and history, there has been no successful attempt to bring unity, a European Union type of cohesion to the continent. So to sort out all these issues, we have a wonderful panel. Beginning from the end, Jorge Quiroga is a former president of Bolivia who's worked in many, many other positions, including the World Bank. Natalia Herbst is a social impact consultant, something you will explain to us. It's an interesting title, who's worked with the government of Buenos Aires. And Adriana Mejía is executive director of the Innovation for Development Foundation, who was previously Colombian ambassador to the OECD. So to start off, I want to borrow a trick from Steve Erlanger, my colleague, when he moderated the Africa panel, and he asked this panel, which stereotypes of your region irritate you the most? And having spouted a whole bunch of stereotypes, I would like to ask you, perhaps starting with you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Serge, Adriana, Natalia. Thanks to the Athens Democracy Forum. Pleasure to be here. Many of you have come from far-flung places, very far away. Probably no one has come from as high as I have, because in La Paz, where I live in Bolivia, the airport is 4,000 meters. You can ask Messi if you ever want to win a quick bet. He's been to La Paz 4 times, never scored a goal. It's the home field advantage that we have up there. Serge, we have plenty of stereotypes. I think Mario Vargas Llosa one time at a forum we were at said, in Latin America, we don't leave the fictional area to the writers like himself or Gabo Garcia Marquez or Borges. We put it on politics, and we have this larger-than-life figure, Fujimori in Peru, Menem, Argentina, Chavez, Castro, that tend to dominate the narrative, and then the perception of South America gets built from that. But having said that, I think what you mentioned at the beginning is key to notice. There are only 2 regions in the planet that have democratic arrangements to work together. Not perfect. You in Europe know that it's not perfect. There's some issues. But we in Latin America, without having the frameworks that you have built in Brussels and the parliament and the currency and what have you, we do have the Inter-American Democratic Charter, the Inter-American Human Rights System, the Election Observation Mission. And I can tell you from experience, having gone to observe elections in Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, other places, that is something to be treasured. And the stereotype of instability does not correspond to the reality of what truly happens in the area. Now, having said that, in Latin America, we do have a democratic charter that says it is not enough to have geographical continuity or borders with countries to be a member of the club. We signed on 9/11/2001, which forever shall be the second most important or relevant thing that happened that day, for obvious reasons, in Lima, Peru. But we signed that saying, to be part of this club, you got to have free and fair elections, independent judiciary and institutions, free press, alternation in power, nobody can stay forever, things that you have in Europe. Is it perfect? No. Do we have exceptions? Certainly, glaring ones. We had 3 dictatorships in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, but we do have a framework. And I know when you go to Asia and Africa, they don't have that. So having those common values leads to the challenge of why do we not do more integration with Europe and South America, but perhaps I'll leave that for another round to integrate, but I will leave you with a tantalizing thought. The train in terms of European, South American integration is about to leave the station and it's not coming back because the trade arrangement discussions between Europe and South America, in particular through Mercosur, Serge, have been going on forever and ever and ever. It's a never-ending date and there's no marriage. And if Europe is not open for business, and the US, by the way, is not open for business, then do not please come preach to us about Huawei, no way, out of the way, get China out of the way, because China is actually open for business. Yes, do I like their politics? Absolutely not. But for South America, they are the #1 or #2 trade partner. They're the buyer for commodities. And I can name 3 presidents that I know well. Santiago Peña in Paraguay, Lasso in Ecuador, Lacalle Pou in Uruguay. Small countries. They would be quote unquote right-wing, and they're queuing up to do free trade agreements with China because you cannot get one through with the European Union or the United States of America. So perhaps we have the Spanish presidency, and I left you with a thought, is this semester it ends in December, and I know they're going through the difficulties of setting up a government, but if with the Spanish presidency we cannot get through the Mercosur-European negotiation, down the road we'll be looking at trade agreements with China, and many in Europe will be thinking, why did we lose the South America links? Well, perhaps because the French agricultural subsidies were stronger than the need to do integration with South America.
Good. Well, we'll get back to unity again. I think that's an important topic. But in the meantime, Natalia, maybe you can tell us which stereotypes are correct, if any, and which irritate you, if any.
Okay, thank you so much to the Athens Democracy Forum for the invitation. And I would like to complement the points, the very good points that President Quiroga made, with a point more regarding citizens and our culture. I think there's a tendency to think about the region under the label of Latinos, which puts in one big bag everyone from Mexico to Argentina, including people usually born in the US from Latin American descent. And this tends to erase the huge diversity that you can find in the region. We speak different languages. We have different races, different struggles for independence. We have had different histories with democracy. And I think that when you use one unique label to talk about all of us, it permeates into political discussions, it permeates into cultural discussions, and it erases all the richness of our diversity in the region.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Adriana, can I ask you the same question? What do you?
Yes, I tend to both agree and disagree.
There you go.
So I do think that the inter-American system has set like a ground for certain common values and unity. However, some governments over the past 15 years or so have made it a point to, open a gap with the inter-American system, and that has been probably at the origin of many challenges in being able to guarantee institutional integrity in the region. So even if the inter-American system has set a very strong architectural design to follow, I do think that we have to be aware that some countries have separated themselves from these set of values. I would also not agree with Natalia in the sense that despite a lot of diversity, we do have a common history and a common, background. Ethnically, there are not big differences, not big differences of religion or of language, despite Brazil being obviously the biggest country and has a different language, but we all more or less understand ourselves. So that would not be like a reason for disunity. Rather, I think it would be a reason for unity because what unites us is more than what separates us. Thinking of the stereotypes and your introductory diagnosis to the situation in South America, I would say that maybe a pressing challenge does have to do with criminal activity in the region, the proliferation of criminal economies, and the way that in many cases this has captured important parts of the state, especially in those countries where democracy isn't alive and well. But also in many other countries where narco-trafficking, human trafficking, arms trafficking make up for a very big proportion of economic activities, especially in those regions that are most vulnerable and poorest. So in that sense, the stereotype would pretty much describe a very worrying problem and the challenge that we have to confront.
Well, maybe we can continue with you since you raised the next question I had. We can go back in reverse order, which was about democracy. Latin America is the most democratic part of the developing world. It's, third only behind North America and Europe. And yet, the various studies have shown backsliding for the last many years. We know the specific countries you mentioned which are a problem, but this index traces backsliding across a broad area. And so continuing with these problems you cited, maybe why is there a backsliding? Is this a problem that can be reversed? Is this a problem that is permanent and continuous? And maybe you can give some examples from your own country, from Colombia, of how this is working.
We were very proud in Colombia to call ourselves the longest standing democracy in Latin America. We never had a military coup, and we have had very strong institutions, separation of powers, and free press, despite a very also long-standing situation of violence and terrorist threats and different kinds of menaces that come from narco-trafficking organizations, guerrillas, paramilitaries, etc. Having said this and having had, like a continuous alternation in power, we're currently before the first radical leftist presidency in our Republican history. And maybe I would rephrase that more than saying a radical leftist, it's like a radical populist. So the institutions are really being put to a test. This presidency has been in power since August last year, so it's just 14 months. But you can really see a tension between the legislative power, the executive, and the judicial, as very radical reforms are trying to be put in place by the executive. And so far, the Congress is resisting, and the Constitutional Court is watching very closely. We don't really know how it's going to play out. Hopefully, the institutions are going to be able to maintain, their positions. But this is a challenging situation, and we have seen, examples of where this can lead in our neighboring Venezuela, for example. More than 24 years of one political party rule with the dire consequences that the whole continent is witnessing, such as the massive migration, et cetera. So I think the real threat to democracy in our continent is radicalism, is extremism, is populism. How that comes to be, probably generated by a lot of fear and anger on very big segments of society. And I would not exclude the possibility of also some kind of influence and a lot of misinformation traveling through social media that enrage citizens and make them make decisions not with their head, with a hot head, but with a level head.
Yeah. Natalia, you work with youth in Argentina,
Yes.
right? Maybe you could tell us, well, first of all, what is your sense of the broad trends of democracy?
Yes.
But specifically, what do you think can be done to reverse it through the kind of work, for example, that you're doing, if it is working to reverse it?
Great. So I'll be happy to share some trends that are common to the region and not specific to Argentina. So as you mentioned, and sometimes they seem kind of contradictory, so it's interesting to understand why they coexist. So as you mentioned, we are part of this process of global process of democratic backsliding, but in that context, we still score as the best as a region from developing countries. And what you can see in that context is that citizens have very low levels of satisfaction with democracy, so they are not happy with how it's working, with the performance of governments, but they still show high levels of support to democracy, which means that they still support it as a regime type. So what you have is a problem that is more aligned with the performance of governments than with the value of citizens, which is a fairly positive starting point. This very challenging situation for governments to deliver successful policies that bring prosperities for the majority is combined with a perception from citizens that once in power, politicians are way more concerned about their own survival, about remaining in power, and with the needs of the elites rather than creating prosperity for the majority. And this has progressively created an erosion of trust in governments. If you ask people in Latin America, 77%, which is a very high number, will tell you that they don't think that political parties work well, but the same kind of amounts consider that democracy doesn't work without political parties. So this brings us to a situation in which I think that the tactics of authoritarian actors have shifted. In the past, as Adriana mentioned, authoritarians used to get into power through military coups in the region in most cases. And currently, their tactics have shifted into infiltrating democratic institutions via elections, either in old parties or starting new movements, and debilitating the system from within. And I think this is a very dangerous trend that we need to be very attentive to. In relation to youth, I was extremely privileged to serve in public office under a mayor at the city level, and who then became president. So I also served at the national level, at the federal level, who firmly believed that youth policy had to be developed and implemented by young people. And so I did this at a considerably young age. And this was not just like having us there for the photo op or having us have an opinion and leave. We were given resources, we were given decision-making power, and we had a mandate to define the priorities of our generation. So my call for everyone here in the room who has a political power or is in politics and is building teams is find the talented youth in your communities, invite them to participate in your teams, because young people are ready. Young people are already creating incredible impact in their communities, and more than anything, they deserve to shape the future that they are going to live in for longer than all of us. So that's my ask for everyone here, and my ask for young people in the room is go and claim those spaces.
Thanks. Jorge, I'd like to hear your opinion about the broad trends of democracy, but I'd also like to get you back to the topic of unity about which you were speaking earlier. in June, President Lula of Brazil held a conference for South America, not all of Latin America. It was again an attempt to get unity, and there was a lot of talk, set up another committee, but at the same time, he gave a warm greeting to President Maduro of Venezuela, which got a lot of people irritated. Was that a sort of a symbolic representation of the broader problem that the shifting ideologies tend to stand in the way of greater unity?
Serge, it was a very disappointing moment because Brazil is very large, very important, and for them to pretend that Venezuela is a democracy and to a criminal tyrant welcome him like he was a democratic leader was extremely disappointing. And it was also disappointing that along those lines, Brazil has a very ambiguous position vis-a-vis the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. The government of Brazil one time said that Zelensky should not be so greedy. He had to just give up Crimea. I can tell you, Brazil took a lot of our land away. They took El Acre, big area, in exchange for a white horse by brute force in the 19th century. So if Brazil's feeling so generous with Crimea, why don't they give us back the Acre? I'll give them back the horse, if that's how they want to deal with it. And it is disappointing. I think that the point of democratic backsliding has to do with that, Serge, and we are at a very critical juncture in the following. When we signed the Democratic Charter in 2001, there was one lone exception, Cuba. Imperfect democracies everywhere else, yes, but we had a club of democracies. Now we have 3 outright dictatorships, and my country on the waiting list, and Guatemala in peril and what have you. And there's plenty of issues. Drugs have taken control of the state in Guatemala. They've seized parts of Mexico. They seized parts of Venezuela from Colombia. There's many things that have to do with that. But Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua were the axis. How did this come about? It was basically a joint venture between the Cuban repressive know-how that they learned from East Germany and the Venezuelan how to pay with a petro-oil checkbook. And they seized control of the hemisphere. There was backsliding. Chavez passed away. And the problem with populist governments is the recipe is populism to get there, hegemony to stay longer in power, and then tyranny to stay forever. And they have reached the tyrannical phase in all those 3 countries. And we have Venezuela, we're supposed to have elections. Nicaragua, there's not a prayer. Everybody who raised their hands saying, I may think about I'm thinking about running for president, they were jailed, deported, their passports taken away, and their houses confiscated by Ortega Murillo. Cuba, you know the story about Cuba. They have a gerontocracy. Sometimes people talk about the gerontocracy in the U.S. Let me tell you, the Cuba, Raúl Castro, Ramiro Valdez are older than my dad in Bolivia, who cannot renew his driver's license because he's too old. And these people have license to destroy other countries, unfortunately. Venezuela is up next. There's a heroic woman, Maria Corina Machado, follow her. And I don't want to over-glorify her, but we, Europe and Latin America, have something in common together. Zelensky in Ukraine, and I don't want to put Maria Corina to her level, Maria Corina Machado in Venezuela. We have elections in Argentina October 22nd. We also have primaries in October 22nd in Venezuela. She is going to win by a landslide. If there was anything close to a free and fair election, she would beat Maduro in a landslide. Are we going to have free and fair elections in Venezuela? Are we going to help Zelensky free Ukraine? And those things are tied together, and I'm not overstretching it. Why? I don't share the Biden definition of when the Ukraine-Russia started, autocracy against democracy. It was territorial integrity and sovereignty, which we understand in Latin America very well. If not, ask the Mexicans. They want California and Texas back still to this day. We understand that. Because if you say autocracy versus democracy, Serge, and then you say, oh, Saudi Arabia, oh, China, oh, Turkey, would you please help us on this autocracy versus democracy? People go, how's that work? No, it's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And we are very sensitive. China should have been sensitive to that argument. But the problem with Putin is that he runs Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. You watch this year, Raisi, the envoy of the Ayatollah of Iran. Where does he go? Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua with the Iranians. They run parts of Venezuela. Lavrov comes to Latin America just last April. He does the tour of Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. The regimes are sons of Putin, which in Spanish is puncher, hijos de Putin. It's puncher in Spanish if you get the translation. So, yeah, they're not, and the translation doesn't work so well. I'll give you another example. But anyway, so Russia is very involved in this area. So we are tied together. And my concern is the following here. There's going to be a tendency in the US, you see it coming, we're tired of Ukraine. No more money for Ukraine. We can't vote the continuing resolution. We got to take the Ukraine money out and what have you. So Europe, you know, that's your problem. And there's a tendency in Europe to say, we're tired of helping Venezuela. Maduro, that's your problem, somebody else's problem. So then let's each go our own way. And the next few months are critical. There are sanctions that have been imposed on Russia because of the invasion. Are you going to start relaxing them in the US? There are sanctions that have been imposed, not to the same degree, in Venezuela. Are you going to start relaxing them? They say we will lift the sanctions on Venezuela if they have free elections. And what are free elections? It's not the balloting and voting on blockchain. It's Maria Corina Machado has to run for president. That's a free and fair election. Otherwise, you won't get it. And when, at least as far as I'm concerned, Serge, so far as Ukraine is concerned, Slava Ukraina, Heroim Slava. Keep going, Zelensky. If you defeat Putin, it will do more for democracy in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua than you can dream of.
Well, now that you've raised the topic of autocracy versus democracy, there is a very interesting case history right now in Latin America, which has nothing to do with Putin or Ukraine, but has everything to do with a popular perception that autocracies are more efficient at solving major problems. This was in El Salvador, which had an enormous crime problem. It was out of control. And they elected Nayib Bukele, right? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but in any case, he went and arrested 70,000 people, violated every conceivable human right, and is enormously popular in his own country, but also elsewhere. I gather there were statues to him being built in other countries, and he's become a sort of a hero. What do you do with that when, in fact, he has solved the problem that he was elected to solve, even though in the process he has seriously damaged democracy? Is that not the plague we're all facing with Trump in the United States as well, when you create kind of issues that only an autocrat seems to be able to solve? Maybe you'd like to. I mean, we're running a bit out of time, so yeah, if we could. That's a very
difficult question,
yeah.
And as a Colombian, I can also say that Colombian citizens have voted many times in favor of security, because security being like the most fundamental right of all. However, understanding that democracy entails a balance between security and the preservation of human rights. It's difficult to say how the Bukele project is going to play out. They have elections coming up, and I do understand that there is like a way in which President Bukele is intending to run again, even if the legal system is not very clear about it. So that's something we should be watching. What I can say is that in Colombia we have regional elections coming up next October, as well as in Argentina, and many candidates are defining themselves like, I am the Bukele of Colombia. So the impact is strong.
Model, yeah.
I don't know if statues are have been put up, but there are quite a few candidates that are describing themselves in that way.
Yeah. In Argentina too, is that, is he popular?
There are very marginal candidates that have directly linked their model with what he's been doing. Unfortunately, we also have in the current election candidates who have very radical platforms, who have performed well for the first time. That was a novelty for us, the kinds of platforms that people are supporting. But I think when us people who work to strengthen democracy and have worked in government, when we try to analyze this phenomenon, I think it connects a lot with something that Adriana said in her first answer about how many times people end up voting based on their emotions. And if most of the narratives of politicians and candidates while they're in office and while they are campaigning don't connect to people's everyday worries and everyday problems, and if these people feel like they are being left out of the story of progress of their country, it's reasonable that they will turn to someone that seems to make promises, even if they are infeasible, that relate to their everyday life. So we had some reflection to do about how do we better connect to those experiences.
Yeah. Well, and Jorge, can I put it to you as a former president? Do you feel that there are times when a democratically elected government is simply incapable any longer of solving a problem, and therefore the public is justified in selecting an autocrat? I hope you say no.
No, never. I would never trade democracy for security, even though it may be temporarily popular. I'll give you an example. And Uribe was had sky-high popularity in 2010. A lot of people said he should have stayed in office with her mandate. They use your country's example. FDR, because people forget, in the US, the two mandates and you're gone was not codified in the Constitution. It was a letter from George Washington. And then after FDR had the third mandate and the fourth mandate in World War II, then it created a perverse incentive, right? If you're in the middle of a war, internal or external, then you can stay in power forever. That's quite of a way of getting into that. And there was talk about Uribe having a third mandate. He had like 90% approval. The judges said no, and he didn't do it. So they did not have to trade democracy for security. I never believe in that. In particular, I don't believe in running against the Constitution, because that happened in my country, that happened in Honduras, that's what Maduro does. If, for the sake of having done something that is temporarily popular, we don't know if it's sustainable, you violate the Constitution, to me, I would never accept it as a trade-off. But given the time, Serge, if I may include one point that, on your first question, kind of reversing it, about the stereotypes of South America. I'll take the other side. What are things about South America that the world does not really know? I guarantee you everybody here has 2, 3, 4 lithium batteries. If I go to my backpack, I have 9 between the phones, the iPad, the Kindle, the watch, the recharger, the earphones, and what have you. I don't have a car yet. We have over 60% of the world's lithium in South America, in a triangle between Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. We have 25%. We're world champions of lithium. And that brings about great opportunities for the world that's coming. Climate change, you don't have to persuade me of climate change. I climb mountains. The snow line in the Andean mountains in Yemeni, where I climb, the snow line has been reduced by 200 meters in the 30 years I've been climbing. That's not a mountaineering issue. That is water supply. So you don't have to persuade me of that. We have to move to lithium batteries, solar. But let me tell you that I'll close with the point that we were making at the beginning. Everybody wants to talk to South America now about the lithium. A lot of preaching, not enough practicing. China is leading the world in solar, in power. Read the New York Times. If you want to figure out how to make a lithium battery, I won't bore you with details. A tennis match, on one side, Iranian racket, on the other side, Djokovic. Comani, cobalt, manganese, nickel. On the other side, graphite. And the lithium is the balls, charge, discharge. Guess who's refining 2/3 to 95% of each of those elements that goes into a lithium battery? China. I was in China, I was flabbergasted. They have the green license plates. The streets are full of the green license plates, electric cars. They're making 55% of the cars, 2/3 of the batteries. They want to engage with South America. And when we go to Europe and say, the trade agreement that we've been talking about for a long time, it's not there. If you go to the US, we used to have a Republican majority and some Democrats that were open to trade. We used to have a Democratic majority and some Republicans that were open to migration. Now, in the US, they don't want our people, they don't want our products. Europe doesn't want to trade. China buys the commodities. They're doing the lithium batteries. And let me tell you that we could get to a situation where the future of electric batteries, lithium-driven with South American lithium, the production chain will go across the Pacific with China. Now, unless, and that'd be sad that with Europe, where we have the common shared democratic values, where we have better arrangements, that we cannot build a transatlantic commercial trade links, because then we will have missed that opportunity. And I think Europe ought to really wake up and say, South America's here, we're ready. I know we have a lot of defects. We practice a lot of integration. We don't preach a lot, we don't practice a lot. We're very good at talking, Mercosur, free trade and the South America, it's crap. Excuse my French, it doesn't work very well. The only place where Mercosur works is in the front line of European soccer teams. That's the only place where Argentina, Brasilia, Neymar, Messi, Suarez, they play together. Back there, not so much. But still, doing trade agreements with a bigger foreign entity, be it Europe, the US, or China, tends to give you rules of engagement vis-a-vis trade and investment that help you achieve what was done with you. But if you were able to use in Europe steel to integrate, perhaps we can use lithium in South America to do the same.
I'm very glad you brought up all these issues, because that was what I'd hoped to discuss next if we hadn't run out of time, which always happens. But I think that is really a key takeaway, that all these key minerals for the green future are in South America, and that only China seems to be seriously aware of that. I think that is a major point to make. I'm very sorry, but we have run out of time. So those who have questions, you can rush up here and attack the panelists. But I want to thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Very, very interesting, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.